My name is Brian Nisbet. I am the Services Operations Manager at HEAnet, which is the Irish National Research and Education Centre. And I'm not going to talk about networks, as you may have guessed, because networks don't work very well when dragons destroy the data center, as discussed. We're going to talk today a little bit about disaster recovery and how to run some disaster recovery scenarios. So the first thing I want to ask, who here has a disaster recovery business continuity plan in their place of work? That is lower than I'd hoped. Who has tested their disaster recovery business continuity plan? So they are the people who have a plan. If you haven't tested, you don't have a plan. You have a piece of paper which looks very pretty somewhere and probably satisfies an auditor. But unless the plan is tested, it does not exist. So, what I'm going to talk about today is ways of testing those plans and hopefully making things interesting for yourself and your staff. So humans do two things, really. We tell stories and we play games. They are really the things that define what we'll loosely refer to as sentient humanity. And if you don't think you tell stories or play games, you're lying to yourself. Water cooler conversations are telling stories. All the things we do to gamify things or something you spend 5 seconds on Facebook or otherwise is playing games. And so that's what we do as things, and they're really powerful tools to educate and to experience things. And there's a whole bunch of games, role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games. You may well have heard of Dungeons and Dragons or things like that, and they are the core of this experience, and a really useful tool. Generally considered to be something weird people do, or at least it was. Now it's super popular on the internet. But they're a really useful, powerful tool, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, because a DR BCP scenario is a role-playing game. You're just playing through a scenario with the members of your staff, and there's lots and lots of information that comes from lots of codified role-playing game systems which have been around since the 70s. Millions of people playing millions of games. So there's lots and lots we can learn from this. Because why ignore vast amounts of written information, of repeatedly trying the same thing, of trying to find really good ways of making an entertaining few hours for a bunch of friends. And since the invention of HEAnet and mailing lists and all the same things that we use to talk about our professions, people have talked about ways of making better games. And what I want to go through in the next 15, 20 minutes-ish is to try and take some of those ideas, some of the ideas which people have talked about for years and years and years, and show how they can be used to improve the testing of the disaster recovery scenarios, which are all going to go away from this meeting. And if you run your company, you're going to go, right, we're going to test this now. And if you don't run your company, you're going to turn around to your boss or bosses and go, why haven't we tested our plan? When are we going to test our plan? And testing these plans is annoying. People are like, oh God, I've got real work to do. But a day of your time, or even a few hours of your time, you can test these things in, and it will make your lives so much better when inevitably something goes terribly wrong. Because we're all engineers. We know inevitably things go terribly wrong. So what I want to talk about really today is kind of from the point of view of what we'd call the games master, the dungeon master, whatever phrase you want to use. So the person running the scenario. Less so the people playing it, but some of that comes from there, and you'll figure it out. Someone asks you what you want to do, you tell them what you think you would do. That's really all the players need to know. So it's the big thing about running a role-playing game, and I've been doing this for some time now, is keeping people engaged. This may sound familiar in your workplace. You want to keep people engaged. And if you want people to buy in to testing your disaster recovery scenario, well, again, you need to keep them engaged. You need to keep them persuaded that this is a useful use of their time. And if people are having fun, for occasionally certain values of fun, good stress, then they will stay more engaged and they will think it's a good use of their time. Now, of course, in work, you can force people to do things. This is less easy in a fun gaming scenario. You can't frog march someone to a table. In work, you can just tell somebody you're doing this today. But it's so much better if that requirement comes with something that they actually enjoy and get something out of. I could talk for days and hours about different ways of running role-playing games, the notion of a system run by a GM, a games master who is God, versus more collaborative systems. But A, that gets far too much into the minutiae, and B, it would take a very long time. However, there's probably an advanced level of this talk I can give at some point in the future which expands on some of that. But anyway, as I said, the main focus you're talking about here is for people to have some fun. People get a bit of a buzz out of it. And I put this talk together after we ran the HEAnet disaster recovery test in 2017, where I had most of the office convinced I'd been kidnapped and was being used as bartering to gain access to one of our data centers. Until someone lit on the good idea of ringing my wife and asking if I was okay. At the same time, I also got a friend of mine as an actor to try and come in and actually gain physical access to our comms room, which was something that most of my colleagues had never experienced before, and it freaked them out hugely. It was wonderful. But anyway, what do you want to do if you're sitting down, you're going, right, I need to test this plan, really need to test it, and I want to do it in a way that might be, might be interesting, might be a little bit different. So first of all, you really need to define your world and your situation very carefully. Now, sure, you've got the real world, but what things are you putting in there? You need to make sure that your disaster, for instance, is plausible. So the one we discussed here, a dragon destroying the data center, I reckon a few of your engineers might have their willing suspension of disbelief a little bit tested at that point in time. I have no known records of a dragon destroying a data center. And when you define that, you as the person running it need to make sure you have answers for the really obvious questions that people are going to come up. So if it's a dragon, as just data center, why didn't all the fire suppression systems work? Those kind of things will be asked, and you need to make sure you have answers for them. And remember that the colleagues, your players in this game, they are fundamentally evil. All players are fundamentally evil, because they will take your gloriously, beautifully crafted plan and do unspeakable things to it. No plan survives contact with the enemy, because they'll come up with things you haven't thought of. They'll ask really awkward questions, which you can only prepare so much for. And one of the big things you have to avoid getting frustrated with that and be able to roll with it, to come up with good ideas. As one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was, if you're going to wing it, at least have a flight plan. So have some framework out of which you can work, rather than having a very strict, delineated set of steps which must be followed. In the world that you're doing this disaster recovery plan, there's probably no magic. Maybe there is. Who knows what workplaces you work in? But I work in one where sadly there is no magic. But people will still come up with really innovative ways of breaking your game, breaking your scenario. They'll come up with a script you haven't thought of, or one weird trick which they've been using for years which will solve things. And you need to be able to roll with that. You also need to be able to inject reality into that. We had in one of our scenarios, someone went, oh yeah, I can get the resilient mail server up in 3 hours. We were like, okay, seems legit. Because the resilient mail server wasn't working at the time in real life. And when they actually went to do it in real life, it took 2 weeks. But again, all of these things you have to be aware of. Someone might go, oh no, there is resilience there because of a thing I did. They might have a sudden blast of genius. You must be aware of these things when you're planning out your world, when you're planning out your scenario, and give yourself some wiggle room and some time to do things. And it's generally best to start, when you're defining this, with some sort of fairly traditional starting point. So, sure, the data center power going down, or indeed being destroyed by a dragon, a DDoS attack, something like that. Start with something that's fairly traditional, but keep a bunch of twists in your back pocket. make sure that you don't just play through this very normal scenario. And we're going to talk about how life is unfair and you need to keep people on their toes repeatedly throughout this talk. Bear in mind when you're setting this up, a really important thing, you should not set up an insurmountable situation. You don't want to put people into a situation where they cannot win, because that is the best way of getting people to just disengage. If they feel there's no way out of it, if they feel that, you know, that's it, we're done, then they'll just sit back and they just won't care. So make sure that when you're planning it out, that there is a victory condition and it's visible and the engineers feel like this is something that they can actually deal with. And importantly, I'm going to use the word engineers a lot. Cool. It should also be your comms people. You know, involve as many people. Comms people are vital in all of these scenarios. Involve as much of your staff as humanly possible in these scenarios. So, even though it shouldn't be insurmountable, make sure that everything is not, it doesn't have to be all totally obvious and clear. There can be lots of bits. There is a fog of war. People may well not be, you know, aware of everything. Why is the company being attacked? Why did the fire suppression system stop working? Keep those mysteries in with those twists. Keep people thinking, keep people engaged. Put a bit of mystery in there. Now, it doesn't all have to be a weird global conspiracy theory that, you know, that someone forgot to plug in the UPS. But again, if people are thinking, if people are there, they're going to be more engaged. I keep on mentioning having flight plan, having some spare space for people to think. There's a thing called railroading in role-playing games, which people feel, you know, there's a single track for this scenario, only one thing can happen. Avoid that at all costs, because again, that is a complete killer from the point of view of engagement. If people feel that any decision they make doesn't matter, that it's all going to end up the same way, they're not going to care. They're going to back away from it. Very importantly, make sure there's something for everybody. Now, this is useful life advice for any work piece, but make sure that when you're sitting around a table or you're going through this, that everyone feels like they have a part to play. And there's a certain amount of active work that the person running this tabletop scenario or whatever kind of disaster recovery scenario you run is required here. Because there's going to be some people who are going to talk more, are going to have all the ideas, and you have to purposefully shut those people down and let other people in the room have a chance to get involved. In no small part, because they've probably got some really, really good ideas which will be missed by the loudmouth person. But also, because if they're sitting there going, dude over there is just going to do everything, then again, they lose engagement, they don't get involved, you lose things as a company, and the scenario won't go as well. But again, it's active. You can't just hope that this will happen. You have to purposefully ask people for their responses, their information, or set out things that requires people to allow others to get involved. And as I said, in that, always keep people guessing, especially those people who think they know everything, because life isn't fair. In any scenario, in any situation like that, it shouldn't be high tempo the entire time. Don't have disaster, disaster, disaster. Let people have downbeats. Let people have moments of calm. Let people think. There's a bunch of good reasons for this, mostly because the world isn't generally on fire all the time, although current events would call me a liar on that one. But giving people a chance to think is a useful thing. And also, you can lull people really easily into a false sense of security. And lulling people into a false sense of security is fun. Because ninjas. Why do I say ninjas? Ninjas are the classic thing in a role-playing game for, right, your party, you're having some downtime, everything's okay, it's a bit boring, you're trying to find a way of getting them invigorated, you have people swing in through the window and attack them. Now, again, that generally isn't going to happen in your workplace, hopefully, but it may well be that another UPS goes down, or then the fire suppression system fails, or the resilient router fails for whatever reason. This is the bit you do after the kind of moment of calm. Bring in this, get people reinvigorated, re-engaged, thinking again, because keep people guessing. Life is not fair. And And you can do this in random if you really want to have fun. You build yourself a table of random things that will happen and buy yourself fun polyhedral dice, which I showed in the first slide, and roll and say, I don't even know what's going to happen next. I don't know whether it's going to be the UPS or the router or the fire suppression system or whatever other thing that could happen in your setup. So that injects even more randomness into it and means that the players really feel like anything could happen in those instances. Now, importantly, it's just a game. This is a vital thing to remember. D or BCP scenarios and things like that, in real life, when something goes terribly, terribly wrong, people get quite stressed. In scenarios, people can often get quite stressed. As a company, as an employer, as a teammate, one of your primary goals is to make life as good as possible for your colleagues, for your employees, otherwise. You don't want a scenario like this to be the cause of people being at each other's throats, getting very upset, having a really bad day at work. Some stress is good, but not too much. So be aware of the fact, because it is a scenario, you can call timeouts. You can say, well, we're going to pause there for a moment. You can allow people to go outside, get some fresh air. You don't need to destruct test your employees or your teammates. This is really, really important. One of the big things we do in role-playing games now is try to make sure that there are boundaries for the players, that nobody is doing something that makes somebody else feel very uncomfortable, while still not trying to go too far. Again, there is some stress, there is some interest there, but again, be very aware of this. I've seen circumstances where people are like, well, we've got to all be stressed, this is the real world. It's not worth it. And again, people will disengage, people will not take the lessons that you want from this day, which is fundamentally how to keep your business going. All they'll remember is the fact that Brad was a complete asshole, and I never want to work with them again. So yeah, just don't do that. And this is supposed to be a positive experience. Make sure, I said that the event shouldn't be insurmountable. Make sure there are victory conditions. Because if people feel at the beginning that they can't win, they'll disengage. If they get to the end and they're like, oh, so we could never win, everything is terrible anyway, then they'll walk away in a really bad feeling. They will not remember what you want them to remember, which is fundamentally how to react when something goes very, very badly wrong. If you give them a victory, and it doesn't need to be a complete victory, I mean, there should be consequences to the actions and decisions that they have made. But if you can find a way to give them as good a victory as is fair, not just a gold star for coming along, but people having worked, people having engaged, then they will remember that and they will go away having hopefully bonded better as a team and have a feeling for, yes, we can do this. We're aware of the bits we need to improve. Have your lessons learned. Have your wash up afterwards. Talk about how your processes can be improved. Talk about how what you can change, what is good, what is bad. But do so hopefully in a spirit of, yay, we did that. We got there. Because I've seen, again, tabletop role-playing games where all the party die or whatever other reason, and everyone's just like, why do I play this game? I don't want to play this game again. This is terrible. Whereas if they feel sure they've struggled, they've worked hard, but they got something in the end, then that is the best way of getting them engaged. And importantly, the victory condition may not be what it initially looks like. Who here, when I put up that slide and started talking about the scenario where the dragon has destroyed the data center, thought that the likely victory condition were the engineers and marketing folk and finance and everybody else courageously stopping or slaying the dragon? Anybody? Or no one had any preconceptions whatsoever? Importantly, as I talk about this, dragons are wonderful, wise, ancient creatures. If they're destroying the data center, it's probably because there's been some sort of terrible miscommunication or misapprehension. I work in education and research. I want the victory condition here for us to talk to the dragon calm them down, get them on board, and use their immense wisdom and skills to improve education and research for everybody in Ireland. That's the victory condition. And it's generally not something your players are thinking about, but will cause them to think more when it is presented to them, or when they hopefully successfully reach that point themselves. Thank you very much. I think there is a roving mic if anybody has any questions. No, I explained everything. Oh. I didn't explain everything perfectly.
Okay, we have one question at the front here. Have we got a microphone? Okay.
Hi, Marek from Felix. Thank you, Brian. That talk was fascinating and resonated a lot with me. We recently ran a D&D style event for a client, and I found the hardest thing at the beginning was to get the engagement of some of the, how shall I say it, more traditional staff. I hear what you're saying about railroading. My attitude to that was to actually run the first half hour as a real-time event. So while everybody's sort of sat doing their usual managerial thing of having a discussion and, oh no, this has just kicked off and this has kicked off. And that added a sense of urgency, and I think after about the first 20 minutes, that bit of railroading got everybody on board finally.
Yeah, and I mean, you absolutely have to have some introduction to the piece, and I would very much agree that is a good way of doing it, of doing that real time. Something is happening right now that you can't ignore anymore. And maybe you can't ignore because you've been told you're not allowed to ignore it. But I would absolutely agree, something like that, something real that shocks people out of their day-to-day and says, right, this is happening now. And then you can figure out if you want a time lapse or otherwise. But I think that's much more effective than just bringing people into a room and saying, you know, right, we're all going to sit down and do this now. So yeah, I'd absolutely agree. And again, when I talk about railroading, all of these things in moderation. None of them are exclusively bad, because there are times you have to say, no, this is what's happening. Stop going off down rabbit holes. Stop trying to invent things in your head. This is happening now. And that's where, I mean, effectively the ninjas are a little bit of railroading. This is happening now. I'm bringing you back on track to consider what's going on.
Lovely talk. I love the idea of the questing party going to the pub with the dragon at the end as the success scenario.
Because they have gold. They get the round in.
Thank you.
Okay, question at the back.
Yeah, Brandon Butterworth, BBC. These things never turn out as you expect, and we had that scenarios for real with 9/11, and we didn't expect any of that, and we had to deal with it in real time. We weren't in the knock, being there ready for it. We're at a separate site, having a meeting when these things started kicking off, and you're never in the right place for all your plans to come out as you expect them, and you just have to adapt with the things as they build.
Life is unfair. That's one of the big things to really make clear, that if somebody says this should happen like this, or you know, if their response to a thing is, well, I would do X, Y, and Z, and the result would be, you know, X. No, we've already used that one. A. Then, as part of the job, as the person running it, is to go, okay, but there's some interrupt. Something else happens here. Something derails your plan, but you have to know why that happens. You have to have a credible reason for that changing. But yeah, absolutely, it's life is unfair, and it's rare that you're all going to be sitting happily in the knock waiting for a disaster.
Any other questions for Brian?
No.
Okay, thank you,
Cool.
Brian.
Thank you very much.